who believed they were doing God's work. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why one historian called this the most systematic destruction of the female body in European history. And fair warning, some of what you're about to hear crosses lines you didn't know existed. Before we dive into the specific punishments, you need to understand something crucial. This wasn't chaos. This was a system, a carefully designed machine of terror that operated across centuries and continents, from the frost-covered villages of Norway to the sun-baked squares of Spain. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was never truly hers. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femme couverte, a covered woman, covered by her husband's identity, his property. And like any property, damage to a territoire was a crime against the owner, not against her. An adulteress wasn't just breaking a marriage vow. She was committing theft. She was counterfeiting heirs. She was destroying a man's most valuable asset, his certainty about his bloodline. Think about the economics of this for a second. In a world without DNA tests, without birth certificates, the only way a man could be sure his children were actually his was through the absolute sexual control of his wife. Her infidelity didn't just wound his pride, it threatened to redirect his entire fortune to another man's bloodline. It could destroy alliances between families. It could invalidate treaties between kingdoms. So the response had to be proportional to the perceived threat. And that's where it gets dark. Because these punishments weren't designed just to hurt one woman. They were designed to terrify thousands. To create such vivid, scarring spectacles that every woman in every village would carry the images in her mind like a brand. The cruelty was the point. The horror was the message. And here's the part that should disturb you most. The communities that carried out these punishments weren't filled with evil people. They were filled with ordinary people who had been conditioned to believe that this level of violence against women was not just acceptable, but righteous, necessary, holy. Let's start with the punishment that was considered merciful. They called it the carting, or the penance walk. But those gentle terms hide something far more sinister. This was psychological warfare, disguised as justice. And the first weapon in this war was the shaving. Imagine you're a woman in a 14th century German town. Before dawn, the bailiff and his men break into your home. They don't arrest you quietly. They make sure your children watch as they drag you to the town square, where a rough wooden stool has been set up. A barber, sometimes the same man who shaved your husband for years, approaches with shears. But he's not here to give you a haircut. Historical records from Augsburg describe how they would deliberately make the shaving as ugly as possible. They'd leave patches, cut the scalp, make the woman look not just shaved, but diseased, monstrous. One account from 1487 describes a woman who begged them to at least make it even, and the crowd laughed. Her humiliation was their entertainment. But the shaving served a deeper purpose. In medieval symbolism, a woman's hair was her crown, her beauty, her feminine identity. Joan of Arc was accused of heresy partly for cutting her hair. For a married woman, her bound or covered hair was a symbol of her modesty and her marital status. To shave it was to unmake her as a woman, to strip away not just her hair, but her social identity. Then came the stripping, and this is where it gets especially calculated. In some regions, they'd leave her in a thin shift, basically a nightgown. In others, particularly in England and parts of France, the law explicitly required complete nudity. Why? Because female nudity in public wasn't just shameful. It was spiritually contaminating. It transformed her into a walking curse, something that polluted the very air around her. Now here's where the psychological torture really begins. She's not just paraded through any streets. She's marched past her own house, past the church where she was married, past the market where she bought food, past the homes of people she's known since childhood. And at each stop, the crowd grows. But here's the truly diabolical part. Participation wasn't optional. Town records from multiple cities show that citizens could be fined for refusing to witness these processions. Your neighbors, your friends, people you'd shared meals with. They were legally compelled to be there. And many went further than mere witnessing. Court documents describe how crowds would throw not just rotten vegetables, but stones, mud mixed with human waste, dead animals. A record from Toulouse in 1342 describes a woman who lost an eye when someone threw a sharp bone. Another account mentions a pregnant woman who miscarried from the trauma. The authorities didn't intervene. This was working as intended. The procession could last hours. In larger cities, they'd take the longest possible route, sometimes parading the woman for 6 or 7 hours under the hot sun or in freezing rain. Some women collapsed, some lost their minds right there in the street, screaming incoherently, which only added to the spectacle. And then came the final cruelty, the return home. She'd be released at her own doorstep, where she'd often find that her husband had already locked her out. Her children had been told not to speak to her. Sometimes her possessions would be piled in the street, already claimed by neighbours. But the punishment didn't end there. That's what makes this so psychologically devastating. A woman who underwent this ritual was marked for life. She couldn't remarry, couldn't get work, couldn't worship in the church without sitting in a special section reserved for public penitents. One chronicle from Paris describes a woman who, 15 years after her penance walk, was still recognized on the street and spat upon. This was social death by design, and it was considered the lenient option. Because when an accusation lacked proof, the system had something far worse in store: trial by ordeal. Even the name sounds medieval and barbaric to us now. But here's what you need to understand. To the people of medieval Europe, this wasn't barbarism. This was the ultimate form of justice. They genuinely believed that God would intervene to save the innocent and condemn the guilty, which makes what actually happened even more horrifying. The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was trial by cold water, and the theology behind it reveals a kind of twisted genius. The water used wasn't just any water. It was blessed by a priest, sometimes taken directly from the baptismal font. The reasoning went like this: since water was used in baptism to wash away sin and welcome people into God's grace, it would naturally reject a sinner. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. So here's how it worked, based on detailed records from dozens of trials across England, France, and Germany. The woman would be brought to a river, pond, or specially constructed pool, usually at dawn. The entire village would be required to attend. Again, compulsory witnessing. A priest would perform an elaborate ceremony, blessing the water, calling upon God to reveal his judgment. The woman would be stripped down to her shift. Then, and this is explicitly documented in legal codes like the Saxon Spiegel, she would be bound in a specific way. They'd tie her right thumb to her left big toe and her left thumb to her right big toe, curling her body into a position that made swimming impossible. Some regions added a rope around her waist, but here's the crucial detail. The rope wasn't for rescue. It was to retrieve the body afterward. She'd be thrown into the water, or sometimes forced to jump herself while the crowd watched. Now, here's the horrifying physics of it. A human body's buoyancy depends on many factors: lung capacity, body fat percentage, the temperature of the water. A terrified woman, taking rapid, shallow breaths, might initially float. And if she floated, guilty, rejected by God's holy water, she'd be pulled out and immediately executed, sometimes right there at the water's edge. But if she sank, innocent, accepted by the water. Of course, a bound woman sinking in water can't swim, can't breathe. The historical records show incredible variation in how long officials would wait before pulling someone out. Some accounts suggest minutes. Others suggest they'd say a full prayer first, potentially 5 minutes or more. Here's a specific case from 1194 in England. A woman named Edgith was accused by her husband's brother. She was subjected to trial by water. The chronicle says she sank like a stone and was pulled out nearly drowned. She was declared innocent. She was also brain damaged from oxygen deprivation and died 3 days later. The record notes that her husband was ordered to take her body for Christian burial, as she had been proven innocent by God's judgment. Think about the psychological torture of this. You're accused of a crime you may or may not have committed. Your fate is being decided by whether you float or sink. Either outcome could kill you, and you're supposed to believe that God is watching, judging, and will save you if you're innocent. Imagine the spiritual crisis. If you sink and drown, did God abandon you? If you float and are executed, did God condemn you? But trial by cold water wasn't the only ordeal. In some regions, they used trial by hot iron. The accused would have to carry a piece of red hot iron for a specific number of paces, usually 9. Her hands would be bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If the burns were healing cleanly, she was innocent. If they showed signs of infection, which given medieval hygiene was almost inevitable, she was guilty. One record from the 12th century Bavaria describes a woman who begged to be allowed to confess rather than undergo the ordeal. She was told confession without trial would result in harsher punishment, mutilation instead of execution. She chose the iron. Her hands became so infected that they had to be amputated. She still died from sepsis a week later. The court declared her guilty based on the infection and denied her Christian burial. Here's the truly sick irony. These ordeals were eventually banned by the Catholic Church in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Not because they were cruel, but because the Church decided that making God perform miracles on command was theologically inappropriate. It was disrespectful to God. The suffering of the women wasn't the concern, the propriety of the ritual was. But even after the official ban, trial by ordeal continued in many regions for another century or more, sometimes rebranded as tests rather than religious rituals. The horror continued, the women drowned, and everyone told themselves that justice was being served. And yet, as terrible as these punishments were, they could still result in death by accident or misfortune. The next punishment we're going to discuss was designed to ensure something worse, that you'd survive, but wish you hadn't. If you wanted to understand the medieval mind, you have to understand their obsession with permanent markers. In a world where people couldn't read, where documents were rare, where identity was visual, marking someone's body was the ultimate form of record keeping. And for adulteresses, the marking was designed to be unmistakable. The laws are shockingly explicit. The laws of King Knut, which governed England and parts of Scandinavia in the early 11th century, state clearly, an adulteress shall have her nose and ears cut off, not as an alternative to other punishment, as the standard punishment. The law doesn't say may, it says shall. Let's walk through what this actually meant. Based on court records and chronicle accounts, here's how these mutilations were typically performed. The woman would be brought to a public square. Sometimes she'd be tied to a post, sometimes held down by multiple men. A blacksmith or barber would perform the cutting. These were the people with the sharpest blades and steadiest hands. No anesthetic, no alcohol to dull the pain. In fact, some regions explicitly forbade giving the woman anything to bite on, because her screams were part of the spectacle. The nose would typically be cut off first, not just the tip, but the entire nose, cut back to the bone of the face. The amount of blood was tremendous. Women would choke on their own blood, which is why they'd often be held face down. The ears would be cut off next, either partially or completely, depending on local custom. Then the wounds would be cauterized with hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of